Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story.
The distress beacon had been dead for 2 years. Whatever sent the signal was long cold, or supposed to be. Darren Cole cut his engine thrust and let the Marin's wake drift into the debris field on momentum alone. Around him, the wreckage of the Dragon Hegemony War floated in slow silence. Broken hulls, shredded wingplates from Dragon Clan warships, the bones of a war that ended 3 years ago and still refused to be buried. He was here for copper cabling and pressurized fuel canisters. Not glory, not history, just parts he could sell at the Roven station market for enough credits to keep flying another month. Darren was not a complicated man. He had been a combat medic once, attached to a human rapid response unit during the last push of the war. He had watched his whole crew die in a single bad hour on a moon with no name. After that, he found that other people's company felt like too much work. He bought the Marin's wake cheap and started salvaging. Alone, quietly, far from anyone who might need something from him that he no longer had left to give. He was 3 hours into cutting when his scanner pinged something strange. The pod was wedged between two collapsed hull sections, almost completely hidden. It was Dragon Clan design, smooth black casing with faint gold markings along the seam. A cryopod, small, maybe sized for a juvenile. The life sign reading made no sense. It showed something alive inside. Darren stared at the screen for a long time. He ran the scan 3 more times. Each one said the same thing. He sat back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, and said several words he wouldn't repeat in polite company. Then he suited up and went out to get it. The pod opened with a soft hiss of released pressure. Cold mist rolled out across his boots. Inside, curled up tight like a sleeping cat, was a dragon hatchling. She was small, barely the length of his arm. Her scales were dark blue, almost black, and they caught the light the way an oil spill does, shifting color as she moved. Because she was moving, she was waking up. Her golden eyes opened slowly, blinked twice, and fixed directly on his face. She made a sound he had never heard before, low and uncertain, like a question. Darren held very still. He had exactly no training for this situation. He said, carefully and quietly, "Hey, it's okay, you're okay." She stared at him. He stared back. Then she made the sound again, louder this time, and it was clearly not a happy sound. He brought her inside. The next 3 days were the strangest of his life. The hatchling was frightened and confused, and she did not trust him at all at first. She hid behind the engine housing and growled at him whenever he got too close. He left food near the entrance to her hiding spot, dried protein packs, the only thing he had, and retreated to the other side of the ship. He talked to her from a distance, not about anything important. He described what he was doing, checked the fuel lines, talked. Patched a coolant leak, talked. Heated his ration pack for dinner, talked. On the second day, she crept out and stole a protein pack from his hand while he was looking the other way. He pretended not to notice. On the third day, she sat 3 feet away and watched him read. He was going through an old disaster response manual he had carried since his medic days, dog-eared and coffee-stained. He read passages out loud without thinking about it. She cocked her head like she was trying to understand. He found out later that she did understand, more than he expected. That evening, the ship's heating system cycled down for its nightly rest period, and the temperature dropped. Darren fell asleep in his chair, wrapped in a thermal blanket. He woke up an hour later because something warm and solid had settled against his left arm. The hatchling was pressed against him, eyes shut, her small body rising and falling slowly. Her scales were warm. She smelled like ozone and something faintly sweet, like hot metal after rain. Darren did not move. He barely breathed. He looked at the stars through the forward viewport for a long time. He thought about reporting her to Roven station authorities. He thought about the right thing to do and what that actually looked like from where he was sitting. Then he looked down at her again. She was smaller than a border collie. She had been alone in that pod for 2 years, in the cold, in the dark, while the war ended without her. He pulled the thermal blanket over both of them. Whatever the right thing to do was, it could wait until morning, maybe longer. He did not know her name yet. He did not know who she was or what she meant to the rest of the galaxy. He only knew she was scared, and she had chosen to be less scared next to him, and that felt like something worth honoring. Far out in the debris field, too distant to notice, a Hegemony long-range scanner swept the sector. It logged the Marin's wake by Hull's signature and moved on. For now, the galaxy did not know where she was. For now, it was just the two of them, and the stars and the quiet. 6 weeks into their accidental arrangement, the hatchling had a name. She had told it to him herself on day 9 in a language he did not speak. She had repeated it 3 times with great patience, watching his mouth as he tried to copy the sounds. He got it wrong all 3 times. She made a noise he was starting to recognize as her version of a sigh, then touched his hand with one small claw and said a shorter version. 2 syllables, Rhea. He called her Rhea. She accepted this with the air of someone making a reasonable concession. By week 6, she had claimed his co-pilot seat, learned 17 words of common standard, and developed strong opinions about which of his music files were acceptable. She liked anything with a strong rhythm and ignored everything else. She had also stopped growling at him entirely, which he considered a significant improvement in their relationship. He had not reported her. He had told himself every few days that he would do it soon. He kept finding reasons not to. He was thinking about this, about what he was actually going to do when they reached the next station, when the Hegemony patrol cruiser dropped out of transit directly off his port bow. It was twice the size of the Marin's wake. Vassoon design, long and flat, like a blade, with the Hegemony sigil lit in orange along its side. Standard patrol class, nothing unusual. The hail came in on the common frequency. Darren answered it, keeping his voice easy. Routine inspections happened. He had nothing illegal on board, just salvage parts and one small dragon who was currently sitting in the co-pilot seat eating a protein pack. The officer on screen was a mid-ranking Vassoon, reptilian face, broad-set yellow eyes, wearing the dark blue of a patrol commander. He asked for hull registration. Darren gave it. He asked the nature of the cargo. Darren opened his mouth to answer. And Rhea leaned into the camera frame and looked at the screen. The patrol commander stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went very wide. He looked at Rhea. He looked at Darren. He looked back at Rhea. His composure, which had been perfectly professional 30 seconds ago, appeared to be having some kind of structural failure. "Please hold your position," the commander said, in a voice that had gone very careful and very quiet. "Do not move. Do not engage your drive." The channel cut. Darren looked at Rhea. Rhea looked at the blank screen and crunched the last of her protein pack. "That seemed bad," Darren said. Rhea said one of her 17 common standard words. It was yes. It was bad. Within 40 minutes, 4 more Hegemony ships had arrived. Not patrol class. These were escort cruisers, the kind that accompanied dignitaries and state convoys. They arranged themselves around the Marin's wake in a formation that was technically a guard of honor and practically a cage. Then the main channel opened, and the face on the screen was not a patrol commander. Grand Sovereign Orath was everything the history files said he was. Old, in the way that only leaders of century-spanning empires are old, not frail, but layered, like something that has survived long enough to become part of the landscape. His scales were deep gold, fading to grey at the jaw. He wore no crown. He did not need one. He looked at Rhea for a long time without speaking. When he did speak, his common standard was perfect. "She lives," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Then he looked at Darren with the focused attention of someone who has just noticed a variable they did not account for. He explained it with diplomatic efficiency. Rhea was the last surviving heir of the Dragon Throne, the seat of authority that the Dragon clans had held before the war. The throne was not merely political. It was sacred to the Hegemony. 3 years of searching. And they had found her in the co-pilot seat of a human salvage ship, eating dried protein. Orath thanked Darin formally for her care. He said it with genuine warmth. Then he indicated that a shuttle would be sent to bring Rhea aboard the flagship, where she would receive proper care. Darin started to say that sounded reasonable. Rhea stood up on the co-pilot's seat, all 15 kilograms of her, and spoke. She did not use common standard. She used Old Tongue, the language of the dragon clans, which nobody outside of scholars and hegemony elders was supposed to know. She spoke it fluently, clearly, and at some length. Every Vassoon officer on the channel visibly reacted. "What did she say?" Darin asked. Orath was quiet for a moment. "She said," he replied carefully, "that she will not go anywhere without the human, that you found her when no one else did, that you covered her when she was cold." A pause. "She also said several things about our presumption that I will not translate directly out of diplomatic courtesy." Darin looked at Rhea. Rhea looked back at him with complete calm. He tried. He told her this was a good opportunity, that these were her people, that she deserved a real home, not a salvage ship. He said it gently and meant every word. Rhea bit his boot, not hard, just enough to make a point. Orath, on the screen, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. In the end, they agreed. Darin would accompany Rhea to the Hegemony capital. Temporarily, Orath said, just until Rhea was settled. Darin nodded and said that was fine. He did not mention that Rhea had her claws hooked into his boot and had not let go. The escort fleet formed up around the Marin's wake and began moving. Rhea watched the stars slide past the viewport. She pressed her side against Darin's leg and stayed there the whole way. The capital world of the Vassoon hegemony was called Vor, and it was the kind of place that made a person feel very small on purpose. The spires were grown, not built, crystal structures that had been seeded centuries ago and allowed to reach whatever height they chose. The tallest ones disappeared into the upper atmosphere. At night, they caught the light from the planet's 3 moons and threw it back in colors that had no names in common standard. The city below moved like something alive, full of species from 40 star systems, all going somewhere important. Darin stood at the bottom of the landing ramp in his cleanest jacket, which was still a salvager's jacket, and thought about how badly he did not belong here. Rhea walked down beside him and drew a crowd before she reached the ground. Word had spread faster than their transit. Citizens pressed against the barriers, Vassoon, amphibious Bane, the tall insectoid Karath, all watching her with an expression Darin was starting to recognize across species: reverence. She was something they had been told about, but never expected to see in their lifetime. She walked through it like she had done this before, head up, tail steady, golden eyes forward. She paused once to look at a small Vassoon child who had squeezed through to the front of the crowd. The child stared at her. Rhea looked back, then made a soft sound, low and warm. The child burst into happy tears. Darin had to remind himself to keep moving. Admiral Sura met them at the citadel entrance. She was Karath, 4-limbed, with the narrow, angular head and black compound eyes of her species. Her rank insignia was the most decorated Darin had seen. She was polite to Rhea with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned warmth as a skill. She was polite to Darin the way people are polite to furniture they expect to be moved soon. She had arranged separate quarters for them. Darin's were in the guest wing, 3 long corridors and 2 guarded doors from Rhea's royal suite. He noticed the distance. He did not say anything about it yet. The first 3 days were a series of ceremonies he did not understand, meals with council members whose names he could not pronounce, and briefings conducted entirely in Vassoon that he had to follow through a translation earpiece that was half a second behind the actual conversation. He took notes in his old battered notebook, handwritten, in block letters, because that was how he had always thought best. An elder council member named Bone noticed the notebook on the second day. Bone was amphibian, wide-set eyes, skin the color of river clay, and the deliberate movements of someone who has stopped hurrying anywhere. He watched Darin write for a while, then asked what the marks were. Darin explained, writing, symbols for sounds. Each word looks like itself on the page. Bone asked to see it. Darin showed him a page. Bone studied it for a long time with the expression of someone discovering something very old in an unexpected place. He said he had never seen a thinking system that worked this way. He asked if Darren would teach him some words. Darren wrote BOEN in his notebook and showed it to him. Bone looked at it like it was a gift. That was how Darren made his first ally in the Citadel. Admiral Sura's campaign was subtle and persistent. She scheduled Rhea's days tightly, cultural immersion sessions, language studies in Old Tongue with scholars, formal meetings with council members. Each schedule was presented as beneficial and appropriate. Each one was designed without a slot for Darren. Rhea attended every session. She also made it structurally impossible to exclude Darren. She introduced him to every council member by name and waited until they acknowledged him. She refused to sit in her royal suite at night until a second sleeping arrangement had been brought in. When one meeting tried to start without Darren being present, Rhea sat down in the center of the room, wrapped her tail around herself, and stopped responding to anyone until he arrived. Sura came to Darren on the fourth evening. She was still polite. She explained reasonably that Rhea needed time to adjust to her new environment, that his presence, while meaningful, might be preventing her from fully bonding with her true heritage, that a gradual transition would be healthier for Rhea in the long run. It was a reasonable argument. It was also completely wrong, and Darren knew it because he had been watching Rhea for 6 weeks. He said just as politely, "Rhea is adjusting fine. She's adjusting to everything at once, which is impressive. She's just not adjusting to being separated from someone she trusts. That's not the same problem." Sura looked at him with her compound eyes for a long moment. She said she would take his perspective under advisement. She did not change the schedules. Darren went back to his notebook and wrote down everything Bone had told him about the Dragon Throne, what it meant, what it would require, what it would cost. The picture that came together over those days was not comfortable reading. The throne was real power, but it was also a role, and roles had edges, and the edges would cut. He looked at what he had written. He looked at the wall between his room and the royal suite 3 corridors away, where Rhea had dragged her sleeping mat up against the door because it was the closest she could get to where he was supposed to be. He closed the notebook. He was starting to understand that this was not going to be as simple as anyone had planned. Nobody told Darren what the throne offering actually was until the morning of the ceremony. That felt intentional. Elder Bones slipped a translated brief under his door before dawn, 3 pages of dense script describing a ritual that had not been performed in over 100 years. A ceremony in which the heir of the Dragon Throne was formally presented with their birthright before the full council in the old sacred language. It was not a coronation. It was an offer. Tradition said the heir had to accept freely. Darren read it twice. He sat at the edge of his cot and looked at the floor for a while. Then he went to find Rhea before the preparation attendants could whisk her away. He caught her in the corridor outside her suite, already being steered toward the dressing chambers by 2 council aides. She broke away from them the moment she saw him, not running, just walking with sudden purpose, and stopped in front of him. She looked up at his face the way she always did when she was reading him, her golden eyes very still. He did not know what to say. He did not want to push her one way or the other. That was not his place, and he knew it. He crouched down so he was level with her and said, "Whatever you decide in there, I need you to know it's your choice. Not mine, not theirs, yours." Rhea studied him for another moment. Then she pressed her forehead briefly against his and made the low, warm sound she made when something was settled. She pulled back, turned, and walked into the preparation chambers with her head high. The Grand Hall of the Citadel held every senior member of the Hegemony Council, 47 beings from a dozen species in formal dress, arranged in a crescent facing the central dais. It was the kind of room that understood its own importance and expected everyone in it to do the same. Darren was in the observer's gallery, alone, which was Sura's arrangement. The gallery was set back and elevated. He could see everything, but he was visibly separate from it. He sat, and he watched, and he kept his face neutral. The ceremony took almost 2 hours. Most of it was in old tongue, which he did not speak, but the translation feed in his earpiece kept up. He heard the names of Rhea's clan, the lineage of the Dragon Throne going back 900 years. He heard what the throne meant, a seat that had once balanced the old order, that had kept the Hegemony and the Dragon clans from turning their power against each other. A seat that had been empty since the war, and whose emptiness had left a wound in the Hegemony's structure that nobody had managed to close. It was not nothing, he had known that, but hearing it laid out in full in that room, he understood the weight of it for the first time. Rhea sat through all of it with perfect stillness. She did not fidget, she did not look toward the gallery, she listened. When Orath stepped forward with the ceremonial crown, a circlet of black metal inlaid with the gold markings of the dragon clans, the room went so quiet that Darin could hear his own breathing. Orath set the crown on the dais in front of Rhea. He spoke the formal words of the offering. He asked, in old tongue, if she accepted her birthright. Rhea looked at the crown for a long time. Then she turned her head and looked up at the gallery. She found him without searching, straight to his face, the way she always could. She turned back to Orath and asked a question. She asked it in common standard, so there was no ambiguity, no translation gap, no way for anyone in that room to pretend they had not understood. If I take this, does Darin go home? The silence was different after that, heavier. Orath did not hesitate. He was not a man who lied by reflex, and he was not going to start in a sacred ceremony. He said, yes. A sovereign of the throne could not have a human in a position of personal authority. The political structure would not support it. Darin would be honored, generously honored, and returned to human space. Rhea was quiet. Then she reached out with one claw and pushed the crown. It scraped across the dais with a sound like a blade being sheathed and stopped at the edge. She said she needed more time to consider. In front of 47 council members, during a ceremony that had not happened in a century. The hall erupted, not in anger, in shock, which is louder. Sura's face went very still in a way that was somehow worse than any expression. Several council members spoke at once. Someone near the back knocked over a ceremonial water vessel. Orath raised one hand. The room went quiet. He looked at Rhea with an expression that had nothing political in it. He said simply, granted. In the gallery, Darin had not moved. He sat with his hands folded and his chest tight with something he could not name cleanly. He had watched her push the crown away and known what that meant, what she was willing to give up. He felt proud and terrible at the same time, which was a combination he had not expected. He also started thinking very hard and very fast, the way he used to in the field when a situation had gone bad and standing still was not an option. There had to be a third way. There usually was, if you were willing to look somewhere nobody else was looking. He opened his notebook and started writing. The collapse happened on the third day after the ceremony, at the 14th hour, when the lower transit tube linking the Citadel's residential district to the public sector failed without warning. It was a structural fault, an old pressure coupling that had been flagged for service 3 months ago and quietly deprioritized. When it gave way, it took 40 meters of tube with it and flooded the subsection below with water from the cooling runoff system. 400 citizens were trapped. Emergency services mobilized. Chain of command was established. Forms were filed in triplicate. Darin was not in the Citadel when it happened. He had taken to walking the lower city in the afternoons, both because thinking required movement and because the engineers in the maintenance corridors talked to him plainly in a way palace staff did not. He heard the collapse. He felt it through his boots. He turned toward the sound. By the time the official emergency team was still organizing at the staging point, Darin had already gone into the maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the collapsed section. He found 3 Vassoon engineers trying to shut off the water feed from a junction panel that required a sequence none of them had the authorization code for. He could see the water rising through the grating below their feet. He could also see on the junction panel's old printed schematic, that the code sequence was stamped right there in the corner for emergency use, which nobody had noticed because they were panicking. He pointed at it, the youngest engineer punched it in, the water feed dropped to a trickle. Then Darren looked at the schematic more carefully. He had spent 6 weeks in this city. He had been writing things down. He knew the general layout of this section, and what he saw on the schematic gave him an idea, a method for equalizing the pressure in the trapped compartment that would give the emergency team a stable window to extract people without the walls giving further. The method was from a human disaster response manual, specifically a section on urban flood rescue developed after a catastrophic tunnel collapse in a city called Rotterdam, written 80 years ago by engineers who had learned it the hard way. Nobody in the Hegemony had ever read it. He explained it to the engineers through a translation device he borrowed from the youngest one. He used short words and drew diagrams on the back page of his notebook. They understood faster than he expected. They were good at their jobs. They had just never seen this specific approach before. It took 6 hours. Darren worked the whole time in water up to his knees, in the dark, in maintenance corridors not built for human proportions. He directed pressure releases, talked to trapped civilians through a cracked wall panel, and at one point physically braced a secondary support strut while 2 engineers worked on the coupling behind it. He did not notice when his ribs cracked. He noticed later when they were done, and he tried to take a deep breath. 63 people came out of that section alive. The emergency team laid. A Bane officer with a broad grey face grabbed Darren's arm at the end and said something in her own language that the translation device rendered imprecisely as, "You should not have been here. I am glad you were here." Rhea arrived before the debrief was over. He did not know how she had found out, but she pushed through the crowd at the tunnel entrance with a single-mindedness that apparently nobody had wanted to physically contest. And when she found him sitting on the ground with a medical wrap being applied to his ribs by an emergency worker, she stopped 2 feet away and stared at him. Her scales were doing something he had seen once before when she was very frightened. The iridescence flickered fast and uneven, like static. He said, "I'm fine." She sat down directly on his boot and did not move. Admiral Sura had been at the staging point. She had overseen the official emergency coordination from above, which was her role, and she had done it well. But she had also been watching the maintenance corridor entrance. She had seen Darren go in. She had received the engineer reports in real time. She had the translation of what the Bane officer said. She stood at the edge of the scene now and said nothing. Her compound eyes were difficult to read, but she did not leave. Orath came to the medical bay that night. No attendance, no ceremony. He pulled a chair to the side of Darren's cot and sat, which was apparently something he almost never did, because the 2 guards outside the door looked at each other with visible alarm. He asked Darren why he had not waited for the authorized team. Darren thought about it seriously before he answered. He said, "Because they were in there and I could help. I had the right information and I was already there. What else was I supposed to do?" Orath was quiet for a long time. He said he had spent most of his life studying the dragon clans, their history, their culture, their way of making decisions. He had read everything. He understood them better than almost any non-dragon living. He had been certain, before Rhea arrived, that he understood what she would need and how to provide it. He paused. He said, "I begin to think I have been studying the wrong species." Darren didn't know what to say to that. He said, "I just read old manuals." Orath looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, like a door that had been closed for a long time. Rhea, who had followed Darren into the medical bay and resumed her position on his boot, made a small sound. Orath looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. Whatever passed between them in that look, Darren was not equipped to read it. But when Orath stood to leave, he paused at the door and said there would be a council session in 2 days, a private one. He asked Darren to attend. Darren said he would be there. Rhea pressed closer against his leg, and closed her eyes. The private session had no ceremony. That alone told Darin it was different. No processional music, no formal dress, no incense from the standing burners, just the council chamber with its curved stone table, morning light coming through the high windows, and 12 council members already seated when Darin and Rhea arrived. Elder Bone gave Darin a small nod. Sura sat at the far end of the table and looked at the wall. Orath entered last. He sat without waiting for the ritual acknowledgement that normally preceded everything he did. He folded his hands on the table and looked at the room. He spoke without preamble. He said he had made an error, not in seeking Rhea, that was right, and he did not regret it. The error was in what came after. He had spent 3 years searching for the Dragon Throne's heir and had arrived at her with a fully formed plan, built on assumptions about what she was and what she needed. He had not asked her. He had told her. He had arranged, maneuvered, and managed, all with the best intentions, and had treated a person like a solution to a political problem. He said this in front of 12 council members, including the ones who had designed those arrangements alongside him. Nobody interrupted him. Then he said he wanted to make a different offer. Not the full Dragon Throne, not a coronation, not a seat of sovereign power, not the weight of a 900-year legacy dropped onto a young heir's shoulders in a single ceremony. Instead, a formal council seat for the Dragon clans, a recognized voice in the Hegemony structure held in Rhea's name to be exercised properly when she came of age. Until then, the seat would be spoken for by a guardian of her choosing, someone she trusted. Someone who would represent her interests without replacing her own judgment. The position would carry real authority, real access. It was not a small thing. He looked at Rhea and asked her what she thought. Rhea had been sitting still through all of it, following the translation feed through a small earpiece Darin had rigged for her 3 weeks ago. She turned her head and looked at Darin. He looked back and said nothing, because this was her answer to give, not his. She got up. She walked around the outside of the table, unhurried, in the silence of 12 council members watching, and came to where Darin was sitting. She stepped onto his boot, both feet. She settled her weight there with the practiced ease of something she had been doing since the beginning. She looked at Orath and said one word in common standard. Him. The council chamber was very quiet. Darin's face did something he did not entirely control. He looked at the table and breathed carefully through his nose, which still hurt from the ribs, and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, in what he hoped was a steady voice, "I'm a salvager. I don't know anything about council politics." Rhea said, in common standard, with the calm of someone statting the weather, "You know everything else." Elder Bone made a sound that was definitely a laugh, quickly converted into a cough. The vote was not immediate. There was discussion, pointed, in some cases. 2 council members objected on grounds of precedent. One raised the question of human diplomatic standing within the Hegemony framework. Darin sat through it and took notes, which seemed to confuse several people and interest Bone enormously. Sura did not speak. When the vote came, she did not raise her hand for or against. She abstained, which in the context of who she was and what she had argued over the past weeks was not nothing. The vote passed. Darin was given a title he could not pronounce correctly on the first try, which Rhea found funny enough that her scales flickered gold for a full minute. He would need to stay on Vor for some months yet. There was a great deal of procedural groundwork, and Bone had already offered to help him understand the council's operational structure. There was also, apparently, a robe that went with the position. He was quietly dreading that. But there was no expiration date. Nobody was going to ease him out. That night, he went back to the Marin's wake. It was docked in the Citadel's private bay now, a berth reserved for state vessels, which it was absolutely not, but nobody had said anything. He sat in the co-pilot seat that Rhea had claimed on day 9 and looked at the stars through the forward viewport. The capital's lights refracted through the hull glass and moved slowly across the floor. A message came in from Issa, which he had been expecting. She was his oldest friend in human space, sharp-tongued and relentlessly practical, and someone had apparently reassigned her vessel as the official escort ship for the Dragon Air's Guardian, effective immediately. Her message was 300 words long and contained 12 questions, 4 complaints, and 1 sentence near the bottom that said she was proud of him, buried so deep in the rest of it that he almost missed it. He wrote back, "Bring snacks. It's a long posting." Rhea arrived 20 minutes later. She had apparently also found her way back to the ship by preference, not the royal suite with its custom temperature controls and silk floor cushions, but this, the Marin's Wake, their place. She climbed into the co-pilot seat and immediately took up more space than anything her size should reasonably occupy. She settled, rearranged herself twice, and went still. Darin did not turn on the drive. They were not going anywhere tonight. He just sat, and she just sat, and the city moved around them outside the glass. He was a man who had spent 3 years trying to be small and unimportant and far away from anything that needed something from him. He had failed at that completely. He found he did not mind. Below them, the capital's crystal spires caught the moonlight and held it. Rhea's scales, dark blue and shifting, picked up the glow from the viewport and turned it slowly, quietly to gold.